Rest.
Do I turn the volume down?
Yes.
Okay.
Mute it.
I'm sitting.
Don't go get it, you're gonna put it up. No.
I told they're consciously going myself. This is with that. Just understand what it feels like.
Hi all, so for those of you that are online, if one of you could just raise your hand and let me know if you see the shared screen and can hear us okay, that would help us out. Lisa, I'm gonna allow you to talk. Go ahead. You'll need to unmute on your side.
Yeah, I can see the screen.
Thank you so much.
Ready to release?
Whenever y'all are ready.
Everybody ready? Hi there. Hello, there we go. Welcome. Is this working? Gotta go close. Eat the microphone, as I was telling. So hi there, I'm Jeff Durbin. I am the city manager. Really happy to be here with you. Really appreciate your interest in attending this. This is the second in our series of education and outreach sessions. This year, you can find more information about all that on our website. under the Marshall Fire recovery page. We're looking forward to the presentation. We're really looking forward to this important work that our consultants are doing and hearing from you as far as your questions, your concerns, your perspective, and so forth. This work is a real priority for us. And so really happy to see you all here in the room. Some business, I guess. It's a webinar, it's being recorded, so this will be posted to our website. So people can access it there, again, on that Marshall Fire recovery page on our website. Bathrooms are right down and around the corner. And we'll do a short introduction, and then our consultant will do a presentation, and then we're going to open it up for some dialogue, question and answer kind of stuff. So really look forward to the discussion. Thank you again for coming. And I'm going to ask Ember Rignall, our open space master, to say a few words as well. I was given a script, but I don't think I did anything.
I'll try to follow my script. So thanks again for coming out tonight. As City Manager Gervin stated, we are very excited to be starting this project, our wildfire hazard and risk assessment project. This project is very important to our community as we rebuild, and looking forward to the future to make sure we can be more resilient and get citizen input for things that we should be looking at and focusing on. I do want to emphasize that this is the very beginning of the project. So tonight we really have three main goals. We really want you to walk away knowing what the project is, what's the scope of work, and maybe what it's not, because there's lots of questions around firework. We want you to understand our project timeline, because we're really hoping to have more engagement throughout this project. So as we move forward in the project, we'll be releasing project findings, and we'll really want the public to come out again and engage with us and look at the findings and provide feedback. So you'll see about some of those dates upcoming in the presentation. And then, as City Manager Durbin said, we're leaving a lot of time at the end for Q&A. So after seeing the presentation and understanding the scope of work, we really want to hear from you to see, are there things that we might have missed, things that we need to include, so the consultants can focus on those moving forward in this presentation. And we are lucky enough with this project to actually have two consultants, and I'm going to read their description. So we're working with Linker, and we're also working with the Ember Alliance. So Linker is a science and engineering firm specializing in environmental hazard and risk models focused on wildfire, climate change impacts, surface and groundwater supply planning, and watershed restoration. This Boulder-based group works on modeling and planning studies for municipalities and state-level agencies, as well as federal organizations. There's a lot to say. The Ember Alliance is our second group we're working with, and they are dedicated to promoting fire-adapted communities and collaboration with communities by leading community wildfire planning efforts, collaboratively enabling wildfire risk mitigation from the local to state level, and providing technical assistance and applied research to support fire and forest management. So with that, I'll have Bill come up and start the presentation and introduce the team. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Ember, for that introduction. Appreciate it. And Jeff, can you hear me all right? All right. Great. So first of all, I just want to say that if you didn't get prompted when you walked in, we have these little survey cards. We definitely appreciate you filling them out if you have a chance. We definitely want to make sure that we're getting any feedback that the community has to offer as a part of this project. So any responsibility provided will help us meet that goal. All right, so today, obviously, we're talking about the wildfire risk and hazard assessment for Louisville Public Land. So thanks everyone again for taking the time out of your day to come today. This is obviously important work, and we know your time is valuable. So thanks again for coming out. All right, so here's our agenda that we'll be talking about. We'll do some brief introductions to the team, and then we'll talk about the project itself, project objectives and goals. And then we'll get into the scope of work and what we'll be doing to address and assess wildfire risk for Louisville. And then we'll talk about the project deliverables as a part of the scope of work. and the schedule of meetings, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for any questions that you all have. All right, so again, my name is Bill Spransky. I work at Linker. We're a Boulder-based group. I've also got my colleagues, Rachel Bash and Nayan Her with me as well today. And then we have our colleagues at the Ember Alliance with us as well today. So we've got Meg and Kenzie, so thanks both for being here as well. All right, so our project objectives here, as we've said before, we're working on developing this wildfire risk and hazard assessment. So we're going to be identifying wildfire hazards in Louisville public lands, and we'll be then developing wildfire risks or assessing wildfire risks and looking for mitigation opportunities again on Louisville public lands. And all of this will be towards an effort of becoming more resilient against future fires. And additionally, some additional goals for this project are that we want to make sure that we're able to communicate our results and recommendations. And so that's a part of what this meeting here today is for. And this is the first of 2 open houses. So we'll talk about the second meeting towards the end of the project. And then we can also use this project to help identify future funding opportunities to achieve our mitigation goals. Okay, so what does this mean? What does this project mean, for the community? What are our outcomes? So we'll step through those here. As I mentioned, we're going to be evaluating wildfire hazards and risks, specifically on public lands. And as a result of that analysis, we'll then be providing mitigation recommendations also for those public lands. And these mitigation actions, we'll be able to use those immediately so that we can implement them perhaps this summer, this fall, spring, summer, fall. And then all the effort of our project will be used to go into our project report. So we'll have a final report that we'll be providing to the city. In that report, we see that as a guide that the city can use to help prioritize their future mitigation action and develop a strategy and plan for what best fits for these public lands. We'll also have a complementary story map, which is basically an online user guide and map-based websites that will kind of serve as a complement to the project report. That'll kind of be a little bit more public-facing document. And then finally, we'll also have some resources, wildfire resources.
Can you add that we're also doing properties that adjoin open lands?
Yeah, we'll be looking at adjacent areas, correct?
Maybe clarify that.
But
Yeah,
we'll be looking at public lands and adjacent areas to those public lands, such as Boulder County open space, City of Boulder open space and mountain park areas. But we won't be doing, let's actually go to the next slide. What we won't be doing as a part of this project, though, is a private property assessment. So this is a risk assessment of public lands, but not specifically a private property analysis. And so, again, we'll be focusing on the public lands and those adjacent areas that we talked about. And we'll show a list of some of the types of locations that we'll be interested in as a part of this project in a little bit here. So again, what we're getting out of this project, mitigation recommendations is obviously a big result of this project that will be important for the city and moving forward and applying results going into the summer and into the fall. And we'll also note that, for many fires, these mitigation and planning efforts can be helpful and impactful on reducing fire damage, the likelihood of that fire damage. But we also note for some of these larger fire events that mitigation efforts may not be as helpful. Okay, so here's a quick summary of our project approach. So this is basically kind of a step-by-step guide of what we'll be doing as a part of this project. We'll start with our identification of public lands. So we'll basically be bringing in maps and shapefiles, digital representations of our objects of interest, our areas of interest. We'll then also be bringing in wildfire hazard results so we can identify and assess our wildfire hazard. We'll be bringing those components together into our risk assessment. And then we'll use that risk assessment to inform our mitigation assessment, where we can identify opportunities for these public lands. And then finally, we'll bring all this together, summarize all this together into our project report. Okay, so here's a snapshot of, our project extent. We've got City of Louisville shown here in white. So this is kind of our area of interest. We've got our public lands shown in purple. These are going to be areas that we're focused on, especially as a part of this project. We've also got some additional features that might be of interest. And as we've mentioned, we're just at the beginning stages of this project. So these layers are definitely not comprehensive at this point, but it kind of gives a snapshot, a flavor of what it is that we're looking at as a part of this project. So we've got some of our surrounding other municipal lands shown there in hash marks as well. Okay, so before we get really into the weeds of the project, I want to talk about risk and of course, specifically wildfire risk, and really define what it is that it means and then how it is that we quantify it. So risk is a product of hazard and vulnerability. And each of those components are calculated in different methods. So our hazard element, that data comes from our wildfire behavior models. And I'll talk more about those models in a little bit. But that has two components: our likelihood, which is our burn probability, our chance of fire occurring, and then our intensity, which we use flame length to talk about wildfire intensity. And then on the vulnerability side, this is going to be informed by our public lands and those geospatial layers that I talked about just a moment ago. So we'll be identifying areas based on their location, which is our exposure, basically where they sit in space, and then our susceptibility, which is what is the effect of wildfire on these different lands and assets. So starting with the vulnerability assessments. On the exposure side, like I said, that's our geospatial data. So we'll start that process by collecting our location data. We'll be taking GIS shapefiles and maps, bringing all this information together to get our city, public lands, and our building grounds of interest as a part of this project. And then also those adjacent areas that we mentioned. So that exposure element is just a data collection exercise where we get all of our areas of interest. And then the susceptibility part is really where we kind of a two-part exercise where we talk about the relative ranking of these facilities, I should say lands and building grounds. So we kind of categorize them based on different areas. So some are public lands, some are building grounds that have assets of interest attached to them, such as the rec center. So we'll categorize those into groups and we'll give them relative importance rankings. And then we'll use a response function, which is basically a method of relating these wildfire effects, the damage of fire on these different assets and valued areas. So those two steps are what we use to then kind of come across and get to our wildfire risk. So I mentioned that we would talk about some of these public lands that we're evaluating as a part of the project. So here we've got a list of those lands. So of course, we're talking about open space properties. We're working with the open space division here, City of Louisville. So that's a big part of this project. Also park properties, the golf course, I mentioned the recreation center grounds, water treatment grounds, wastewater grounds, and these significant landscape features around and adjacent to our public lands of interest. So this is kind of a snapshot of things that we'll be examining as a part of this project. All right, so to kind of wrap up our vulnerability discussion, as I mentioned, that first element is a geospatial analysis where we gather all that data, bring it into our mapping framework and see where they lie in space. And then we perform gather our response functions to understand how they relate to wildfire hazards. So again, this map just kind of shows those types of properties that we're going to be looking at. This is in kind of coarse detail, if you will. As I mentioned, we're just starting this project, so we'll be bringing all these layers into our GIS framework and starting that examination of our vulnerability. All right, and then the other side of that risk component is wildfire hazard. So here I've got a map shown. This is the state of Colorado. The counties are there faintly in the background. So I wouldn't get too focused on the color. There's no legend on this map, kind of for a good reason, but this is the Colorado wildfire risk model, and this is what we'll be using for our wildfire hazard assessment. So this is a wildfire behavior model, and this is what we use to analyze our wildfire hazard. So more specifically, when we talk about wildfire hazard, we've got a snapshot here that kind of shows our wildfire behavior model framework and what that looks like. So starting with model inputs, we've got a variety of inputs that go into that model and drive or force that model to simulate these wildfires. So model inputs include like weather data, climatic data, such as air temperature, relative humidity, wind speed. We've also got topographic data, so we can understand slopes and elevations. We've also got vegetation and land use data so that we can understand if we're talking about urban areas, or forested areas, or grasslands. And that also includes fuels data that's fed by the land fire fuels data set. So all that information comes in, components of that wildfire model so that we can run and simulate wildfire response. The model output side of things, we get two major outputs that we're going to be concerned about and talking about today. And that's burn probability and flame length, which is listed here as fire intensity. And so those two components, I'll talk about those a little bit more in the next few slides. Those two components come together to give our wildfire hazard. And I should also just mention that on the state's model, that was a 30-meter distributed model for anybody that's interested. And that was last updated 2017, 2018. They are also doing some more updating now. So we'll be in talks with them to see if we can get the latest and greatest information. It's the Colorado State Forest Service it's their model, and they run it in conjunction with their consultants. And that group previously was called TechnoSilva, and I believe that they're still working with them this time. Yes.
They incorporate the marshal fire information, because that was quite an anomaly compared to what typically happens.
Yeah, I can't say for certain that they will, but I would imagine that they will be incorporating that. And actually, let's go ahead and go to the next slide and I'll show you why. So burn probability is one of these two major outputs that I mentioned. And I'll get back to your question here on this slide. So we can think of burn probability as the annual probability that any location in our modeling framework will burn due to a wildfire. And so this burn probability is calculated in part, fed in part by historical fire occurrences. So they've brought in, let's say, the past 20 years of fire locations across the state. That information is provided by federal, state, local agencies. All that information is brought together, and it basically puts a heat map, if you will. I don't have a picture of these ignition data, but that information is out there. So basically you can have a, almost like a probability map of where historical fires occur. And they use that to help inform these burn probability calculations. So the other parts of calculating burn probability is using the model itself to basically simulate, do what we call a Monte Carlo simulation, where they run like 2 million model runs to estimate how wildfire spreads across the landscape. So they'll ignite fires in different locations all around the model domain. And that model framework, all those simulations come together to produce this burn probability map. So here I've shown, we're zoomed in on Louisville. We've got a kind of a categorical scale of burn probability, and this is just straight from the state's model right now. So again, we're not really, we haven't done any analysis as a part of this project. But this is just that existing framework, you know, kind of like low to high burn probabilities.
Yeah, so is Superior higher because of the Marshall Mesa coal seam?
I don't know if that kind of information is brought into this modeling framework. So I can't say with any certainty if that is. I would lean towards no, but I'm not sure about that. However, I would say that if there are more ignitions around that area, then it would be reflected in the sense that there would be historical ignitions there. Yes.
Is the state looking at the difference between, you mentioned that they were looking at forest fires. Are they also looking at grassland?
Yes. Yeah, they're looking at all types of fires across all different types of vegetation and fuel domains in the state. So this isn't just a forest fire model. It is a statewide risk assessment framework. So it does simulate wildfire across all different landscapes, whether it be grasslands or forest fires.
Always gonna be a time for it.
Correct. Yeah, that's a struggle with any time we do any modeling, in the sense of climate change is something that we talk about all the time as scientists, modelers, engineers, is that we're moving from a time of, you know, what we've referred to as we're moving into non-stationarity, where our previous assumptions, our historical observations are not necessarily reflecting what we might see in the future.
So Bill,
Yes.
when there's a question, could you, I'm thinking, yeah, okay. Can you repeat the question? So
Oh,
that it's
sure.
Picked up on the microphone, so
Yeah.
that for the webinar, people know which question you're answering.
Yes, absolutely.
Great.
All right, so the second component of our wildfire hazard that we're really focused on coming out of the wildfire behavior model is flame length. So I'll just read this bullet out to you all. It's a measure of the height of the flame from space ground to the flame tip. So the way that the model outputs these measurements or these simulated flame lengths are by categorized flame length bins, so 0 to 2 feet, 2 to 4 feet, 4 to 6, and so on, up to 8 to 12 and 12 greater. So this is kind of a measure of wildfire intensity, and we use this to help connect our vulnerability and hazard analysis together. So I'll say that flame length, let's go back real quick. I'll say that flame length is really driven in large part by our fuel data, as well as our wind speed information. All right, so kind of bringing this back all together for our wildfire risk, as I mentioned at kind of the start of the project approach, our risk is our product of our hazard and our vulnerability. So we talked about all those components, but I think that these 3 bullets really help kind of bring it down. We've got our burn probability, our flame length probability maps, because it's actually a series of these different flame length bins, and then our public land susceptibility. So those public land susceptibility are those spatial assets, spatial lands that we talked about, and relating those to wildfire intensity and wildfire effects. So when we bring those three components together, then the product of those is our wildfire risk. And that's kind of what I've got shown here on the map. But I've grayed this out on purpose because as a part of this project, we'll be calculating or we'll be assessing wildfire risk based on the assets, the public lands, the building grounds of interest as a part of this project. So this is a data product that is on the Colorado Wild Risk Viewer, but we'll also be working on this as a part of this project. Okay, now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Meg, and she's going to talk about some of our mitigation work.
Hello, my name is Dr. Meg Ratonis. I have my PhD in forest ecology, and I've been an on-call firefighter with the Larimer County Sheriff's Office for 8 years, and I've assisted on initial attack and extended attack fires in northern Colorado and wildland urban interface communities, and a couple prescribed burns in Boulder County. I was recovering from surgery, so I wasn't on the county crew who responded to the Marshall Fire, but I had a lot of friends from the crew who shared some of their experiences, and that it really was a capable event. And I can't imagine the impact that it had on you and your community. So thanks for entrusting us to help your community learn from the past and look forward. So we really are interested in your perceptions about your concerns around wildfire risk on public lands. So your comments on the feedback forms will be taken. They will be taken seriously and taken into account, especially as we get into identifying potential on the ground actions that can help address risk in your community. So when we identify these mitigation opportunities, we will be using the output from the risk assessment that Bill was just talking about to help quantify based on models where there's areas of greater wildfire risk, greater risk of direct exposure of values at risk to flames and ember. And then we're also going to do an on-the-ground assessment. So we're going to look at some of these high priority properties, including Davidson Mesa, the Cold Creek Corridor, and the Recreation Center. And we will do a standardized assessment that we have utilized in other communities to look at both the built environment, so what are structures built out of, like gazebos and things around parking lots, not like homes, but other structures that are owned by the city. And then also looking at vegetation and information that you can't just get from satellite imagery on the ground, looking at how vegetation connects, how fire could move from different fuel components, and then use that to help come up with a suite of different mitigation actions that could occur in different locations. And some of that will factor in feasibility of doing treatments, different trade-offs, and that's something where I think we'll talk about this in a little bit when we come back to some more public engagement. We want to know how some of the different mitigation actions can either benefit other values that people have for public land, or maybe there's some trade-offs that have to occur, like wildlife habitat or recreation opportunities. So that's something, that's not a science-based decision that requires that the communities involved say, yes, we're willing to accept this trade-off when we're doing these mitigation actions. Mitigation of wildfire risk, especially in really complex communities where you have wildland vegetation moving into more urban areas, really requires a holistic and layered approach. I wish that there was a silver bullet, one action that would address all the risk, but it's not a satisfying answer, but it really is true. There's a lot of different mitigation actions, and some of them are more appropriate in some places than in others. And that's why we're going to be going on the ground, getting our eyes on these sites and coming up with recommendations. One of our coworkers is a certified wildfire mitigation specialist from the National Fire Protection Association. She took a course and an exam and has done these kind of assessments in other communities in Larimer County and Jefferson County. And the output of that will be relative risk rating. That'll also factor in what Bill was talking about, looking at wildfire intensity and likelihood. The next slide. these are just some examples of mitigation practices, and some of these might make sense and on some properties, and some of them might make more sense on others, and some of them, the trade-offs that these options could pose for other values are more acceptable, might be more acceptable to the public than in others. For example, burning vegetation in ditches can be a really effective way to mitigate growth in ditches, but there's areas where that might not be something people are comfortable with, whereas there might be other areas further away from homes that it is. So that's something that will be factored into the recommendations. Replacing highly flammable vegetation with fire-wise landscaping might make sense in some areas around parking lots. Probably not across an entire open space where natural vegetation is an important function and value of that area. Mowing along trails and fence lines, the Marshall Fire facilitated learning analysis talked a lot about fences and the separation between wildland vegetation and fences and homes. So that's the on-the-ground observations of that will help us with these recommendations for what the city can do starting this spring, summer, fall, and then some of the actions will take a lot longer, and we'll need to we'll have to find funding, and it'll be a staged approach. Yeah, I think that's it. There's we'll take questions a little bit, but yeah. We're looking forward to walking around your community and hearing your observations about what happened on the day of the fire and how things are recovering.
Thanks, Meg. That was great. All right, so starting to wrap things up here. Our project work, this is a list of our deliverables that we'll be working on with the city. So really the final report is kind of the big item. We will be, summarizing our wildfire hazard analysis, the public lands that we talked about identifying, bring those together into the risk assessment, and of course, summarizing the mitigation recommendations, and bringing those into a map-based framework as a part of the report. Of course, we're also having public meetings that is also part of this project, part of the project deliverables. Today is just one of many that are public meetings scheduled as a part of this project. And then also we talked about providing community resources. So we'll be having some information, links, brochures available online as a part of the project. And then to complement, I mentioned the story map to complement our reports. These are helpful tools, web-based tools to go along with the more formal traditional paper-based or PDF-based reports. So they can also often have the interactive, they can have maps that you can scroll around, zoom around in. So we can kind of summarize some of the results of this analysis in the story map as kind of a public guide to go along with it. All right, and then our project schedule, obviously we're here on my right, your left side of the screen here at our first public open house meeting today. And again, thank you all for attending today. So we're just starting our project with our hazard identification, risk assessment. We're starting that process now. When we start to finish or complete that, we'll move into our mitigation phase. Where Meg and her team will be doing great work, both in the desktop environment using geospatial data and also on the ground here looking at different sites of interest. And then we'll bring that information together, work on our draft report and move that into the final report. And as we do that, we'll also be meeting with the Open Space Advisory Board committee, as well as doing a second public open house with that date a little bit TBD. We've honed in on the week of May 22nd. And then we've got 2 city council meetings as well, so we can kind of review both the draft and final report with council and another second advisory board meeting in between. And so this just kind of gives those dates of some of those meetings that we've got scheduled coming up here. So again, our open house today, second open house is, we're still working on finalizing the date, but we've honed in on a week of May 22nd. And then we've got 2 more advisory board meetings and 2 city council meetings spread between May, June, and July. right, and then finally, we also wanted to just provide some information that the city has put together. They've got a great website that lists all the engagement series, learning series that they're doing as a part of this project and other work going on in the city and the county. And so we are here at this open house today. Last week, there was the Community Wildfire Protection Plan that was also really great. There's a couple more meetings in between, and then we'll have our follow-up meeting in the future as well. So definitely attend these if you can. It'll be really helpful information. This reducing your risk at home meeting will be really great, where it'll be talking about what you can do for your home rather than what projects focus on the public lands. And so here's the website there, which is really long, but it is a great website, so definitely check it out. And then with that, we'll open up to questions. And first, I just want to reiterate, as Meg mentioned, that we did provide these survey cards. We do really want to get your input. And so please do fill those out. And we've got an anonymous box in the back, so you can just drop those in. And it'll just be good for us to understand, get your feedback and input on this project on public lands. And
Before you go to questions.
oh, sorry, yes,
Can I add a couple things?
yes.
Um,
What about the PowerPoint line?
Oh, yeah. Well, just a couple things. The website link there is long, but if you go to our website, louisville.co.gov, there's a red banner at the top that takes you right there. Right?
Yes.
Yes.
Look for Resilient Louisville once you're there.
What's that?
Once you're there, go to Resilient Louisville, then you see all that.
Resilient Louisville.
2 clicks.
Two
Yeah.
clicks. And second of all, before, I know this question is gonna come up. Why are we just doing a study now, and why now, why not a year ago? We started doing mitigation. Ember and her team have been out doing, mowing of perimeters of open spaces and strategic locations last year, this year. If you've heard from people like I have, there's some opinions out there that we should let open spaces be natural, i.e. just let them be and grow tall with natural grasses. Other people think we should mow the entire open space, pave it all over. So there's a lot of different perspectives out there. And the schedule that Bill shared with you is intentional. We want to get through this process, this dialogue, and get to some decision points as part of the budget process. Because we'll continue to do the things Ember's team has been doing this year, and maybe you can talk about that a little bit. But also moving into next year, if we're going to change our land management strategies, that means changing our resource allocations, which ultimately comes down to money, which means as part of the council budget process, we need to have that conversation. What are we doing? What's it going to cost? How do we pay for it? What are our priorities and so forth? So pay attention to that budget process as well. And I do want to emphasize what Bill said. The preparedness at home is really something important. Please talk to your neighbors about it. I spent a lot of years up in the mountains. People in the mountain communities tend to know what happens with a fire. The front range is a new thing, but people need to be prepared in their homes as well. So I'm really passionate about that. So I'll share that story. That meeting. Remember, do you want to talk about what you're currently doing real quick?
So some of the activities that you've probably seen for several years, we've been mowing trail corridor edges for probably 15 to 20 years. So on our open space trails, some of them go through the middle of the property, some of them are perimeter in nature. So on each edge, you'll see a 5 to 8 foot mow strip bordering the trails. So we do that probably 3 to 4 times a year, depending on the growth stage of the vegetation. The other thing that we enacted following the Marshall Fire was we started doing mow lines on fence lines in specific areas. And we're really targeting, to the city manager's point on timing, this project is also supposed to end in July. So we're hoping that will put us in place for more mitigation efforts for the fall. So when the vegetation is cured and dried up, we have more mitigation opportunities. But right now we've been mowing property lines twice a year. So we mow them once before the 4th of July, and then we mow them again in the fall to prepare for the dry winter season. So that's been going on this year, and that will continue while this project's underway. So we will keep those practices in place as we're looking at additional or alternative mitigation opportunities. The other thing you probably saw last year is in some of our parklands that are not irrigated and larger parcels, those were mowed several times throughout the year. So that's another strategy we've been implementing. We've also gone through in a lot of places, specifically on open space where you've seen burned material, we've limbed up those branches on a lot of the evergreen trees. So if there is a grass fire, it's not going to climb up the tree. It would hopefully stay low and go out quickly. And we've also seen work in collaboration with Public Works in the ditch company. So you may have seen some areas in town where ditch cleaning has been occurring. Lake Park is one of those areas. And that's another effort that we're going to continue to collaborate with other departments and other entities to see what else we can do for ditch mitigation. So those are some of our current. Oh, and coming up, so in the past, we have also worked with goats, and over the winter, we have been planning for more efforts. So in the spring and fall and summer, you will likely see goats or cattle on some of our properties. So we're looking at starting the grazing at Davidson Mesa in North Open Space. And each animal has different benefits. So the goats we're looking at North Open Space, because they do a much better job limbing up trees and woody vegetation. And again, talking to public benefit and concerns, some citizens will be in favor of this from a fuels mitigation standpoint, and some citizens might find that now the trail users are visible from their backyard, whereas before there was a buffer of vegetation so they couldn't be seen. So again, there are definitely trade-offs, and that's one thing we'll be talking about throughout this project, that you will see goats and you see cows this year on those properties. So that is coming up. I think with that, we're ready to open it up for questions.
Got a question about Davidson Mesa. A few years ago, it did get mowed completely down. And I don't know, it's been several years, but I do recall, I don't know what reason there was to do that. But it was certainly done. I know the weeds got up really tall and that sort of thing. And it was just kind of a surprise when it was completely mowed down, which I'm not opposed to. I'm just wondering why it was done at that point and not done subsequently.
So to repeat for our audience online, the question was around mowing at Davidson Mesa. The citizen knows it had been done. It was curious what the purpose was, and you were right, that was for weed control. So at Davidson Mesa, there is a large patch of Russian thistle that is really hard to treat. We have found that successful treatment is with a combination of mechanical control mowing and also herbicide use. So at the city, we're very careful with our herbicide use and take a multi-pronged approach. So the mowing you saw was to mitigate the weed growth. And those weeds, if you're familiar with them at Davidson Mesa, can break off and turn into tumbleweeds, spreading the weed seed, which is why we like to mow it and drop it in place, but also creating a fence line hazard because those fuels will blow. And if there is a fence line, they'll collect on that fence. And you'll see usually if that happens, we do come by and collect them. But that's an effort to get one step ahead and try to drop the seeds and the fuel in place. So that is the mowing you're referencing.
I'm gonna just real quick, for folks at home, if you want to ask a question, just go ahead and use the raise hand button down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and rotate between online and then in the room questions as we go. I don't have anybody with me.
Okay.
Thank you. This is more of a comment than a question. I know these are data points and assessments to you, but as a resident on the day of the fire, even though we were registered with the emergency alerts, we got nothing. Nothing on the phone, nothing on the cell, nothing on email. And we evacuated based on air quality. I got the car and I drove down McCaslin just at the time when the enclave was burning over into the neighborhood across the street. So I drove through flames and smoke to get to South Boulder Road, where I sat for 2.5 hours with no cops, nobody directing traffic. And had the fire come over there, we all would have died because there was nowhere to go. So I have not been comfortable in my city since then, and I think it's an absolute minimum for a city to protect its residents.
I'm going to try to rephrase that because I forgot to hand over the microphone, but sounds like a concern for safety and emergency response day of the fire.
Because it was non-existent.
Because it was non-existent and how do we move forward with that? So we have noted as a city that that has been a concern for many citizens. Day of the fire, I think, is being taken very seriously. Well, it's not a part of this study per se. It is something we will be addressing as a city. And any comments that aren't directly connected to this project, we will still record tonight and make sure they're getting to the right people who are
Thank
working on those issues.
And this is off the subject too, but we live in the Meadows subdivision.
Cold Creek.
Sorry. And one of the issues that I noticed during the fire, well, we got notified of the fire by our neighbor across the street who worked for NOAA. She's the one that said, yeah,
Get out.
get out. But the fire went around us, okay? So one of the features that I noticed was that there are a lot of cinder block buildings on the upside of where the fire was occurring, okay? So the cinder block buildings didn't appear to burn down. It seemed to protect us. The other thing I noticed was that these underpasses that have been built on 36, and there's obviously one on McCaslin here. You know, my background's engineering, so what I noticed that there's a Venturi effect that's occurring with those underpasses. And I know they're expensive to build, but I wonder how much that has to do with it. And I know the fire, just from casual observation, followed the rivulets of where the water rivulets are. It's obvious that the fire propagated along those rivulets, along with the wind and that sort of thing. So I just want, you know, in these mitigation efforts, it's not only just the fuel, but what has been done, I think, as the things have grown, we put our own human touch on things as far as these venturis that have been built under these roads. And I think that's something else needs to be looked at. Sorry, it's just, it's something that, as an engineer, I noticed that it's just obvious that certain things have created an enhanced hazard. And I also know that the construction of stick built buildings versus cinder block buildings had a lot to do with what burned and what did not.
Yeah, that's a great observation. So I guess one way our project is tying into that is we are looking at landscape features and other features that could convey wind or fire into the city. So we'll be looking at structures that are adjacent, similar to that. The other thing we'll be doing with this study is where we might not go into the specifics of the underpass and the engineering. We will be creating sort of a list of things we've learned through this process that need to be addressed in other areas by other experts. So we'll be capturing those thoughts for potential future consideration as well.
Yeah. My request is just be cognizant of unintended consequences of some of these things that are conveniences.
Yes, it's a great observation.
We have an online
Online.
question. Hold the mic here real quick too. Next week's meeting is all about evacuation and what work the county and the local governments have done related to communications around that. So just a reminder, that's next week's. Larry Donner, you are up next if you want to unmute on your end.
Thank you. Many of you have heard my concerns before. I'm not for totally mowing all of open space, but the lack of buffers really do reduce the potential for firefighters to make a stop before the fires get into the neighborhood. So I'm gratified that the city's recognized that and is beginning to reestablish the buffers that were in place 30 years ago when I moved to the community. And I would just like to encourage the city to continue that. And whether the buffers are mowed, grazed, or whatever, it will be really beneficial. If you look at the entire pattern of the fire, where the firefighters were able to make a stop and where the fire laid down, it's where the lands, quite honestly, are still under agricultural use. And that's because they're either grazed down or mowed down. So I encourage the city to continue to look at how to buffer that. And And with regard to what the built environment, the continuity of fuel through the towns as through the town as it follows the open space. And so I'd really like to encourage continued maintenance. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll go right behind you first and then after.
Thank you so much for doing this. It's very reassuring that you all are working on this. I'm Ann Brennan. We lost our entire Cornerstone neighborhood right across the street here. We back up, we're on the east end, we back up to the fire station land. So one question is, I hear some of this study is about hazard and risk to open space and features like the rec center. We're all very happy that didn't burn. But I think those of us who lost our homes and neighborhoods are more concerned about risk and hazard from the open space. The fire department owns that land. The fire didn't come from the fire station land. We know that. We probably it came from us to them. But we had always had problems with or concerns about that land. It was mowed for a few years, but the last several years it hasn't been mowed. Even the buffer hasn't been, the fence line hasn't been mowed unless we asked for it. And they've been great about mowing it when we ask, but it's not mowed routinely. I know the city doesn't own that land. I would like to know specifically if the city can enter a partnership with the fire department. We're living all the way around them. But then more broadly, other owners of open lands within the city limits, private businesses, Omeda, whoever they are now, Gaia up on the hill. There's lots of open lands that are not owned by the city inside the city limits. And they should be partners in this study, even though you can't control them. They should be part of the study. Can you address that?
Well, I'll start and then I might hand it off as well. But I would say this study is very much addressing risk to open space as well as risk from open space to public lands. It's actually one of the very first statements in the RFP that we put out. So we are very concerned about impacts as neighbors. We're your neighbors and we want to be good neighbors, and we want to look at anything we can do to improve the process and have the public and the community weigh in on the decisions we make going forward. So to address that, yes, I very much think we are looking at both sides of the fence line. And as far as involving others, specific to the fire department, the chief is involved. He's been included in all of our meetings up to this point, helping us write the RFP, reviewing the RFP, selecting the contract team. The fire department will be engaged moving forward in the meetings that staff has with the consultants. I can't speak to future agreements, but I believe we are trying to look at this comprehensively because we really do feel as a city that everyone has a role to play in making our future as positive as possible. So we definitely see the connection between our land and others. And we'll do what we can to make that a collaborative effort.
Can you clarify? I think you said the wrong word. The risk to open space and from open space to private land.
Yes, that was my intent. Sorry, the risk in both directions. Yes.
Yeah, I was concerned also about the buffer zones with open space. I had a friend who lived in the enclave with a backyard that went up to the pathway on the mesa with a gate and a fence and probably I'm guessing a 10-foot buffer zone after that, and our house burned to the ground.
I will let the consultant speak to this, but I think this was a very, very challenging event to fireproof, if you will, with the winds as they were. So I think one thing the consultants will be looking at is the range of events and what is going to be more successful under more average conditions. I'm going to hand this one over to you.
Yeah, I will say that there is no, as Megan alluded to, there is no silver bullet solution here. We'll be examining the areas that we talked about that we discussed today. We'll be looking at all kinds of different mitigation options that we can implement. And, you know, I think the balance here, the hard part is that each of these efforts cost money. And so the purpose, you know, one of the purposes of this project, you know, obviously we've talked about many of them, but one of them is to really help prioritize those mitigation efforts. And so, you know, there's, you know, probably 1,000 things we want to do, but from the city, probably from the city's perspective, they're using limited mitigation dollars and they're trying to figure out where to best invest them. And so this study is a guide to help them on that path.
Is there somewhere that's burned that have a lot of fire mitigation beforehand and the results of the team? How optimistic can we be about what might come out of this?
Yeah, so the question is how effective are mitigation efforts at preventing fire? And I guess I don't have a good answer for that for the Marshall fire, for instance. I think that obviously is a unique fire in this area, and it's a unique fire. It's one of several unique fires in the state. So I think that as far as what mitigations were impactful, you know, that's really probably something that you would have to look at the property to property level. And I think that if you were, you know, in the path of the fire with the winds coming in, I don't know that there were many effective mitigation measures, to be honest, but I would also defer that to a little bit to like fire chiefs and fire experts, which I'm not a fire specialist. So yes.
One of the things when we talk about fire is people talk about not ever having another fire again. If you look down in hurricane country, they don't talk about let's not ever have another hurricane. They're going to have another hurricane. Fire is a part of the natural ecology in Colorado. So mitigation is one of the things that we really can do to mitigate. That's the word, right? So every little thing we can do is something I think we have an obligation to do. Can we prevent a fire? I would say that isn't going to happen anywhere, but can we minimize the impact? I definitely have seen very strong successes anecdotally in terms of you know, fire breaks and those type of things. When firefighters are fighting wildfire, they're looking for fire breaks. And so if we create those fire breaks, you know, that's going to help them out.
All right, we can take an online question. Next up, we have David Sweedler. David, you can unmute on your end.
So I unmuted.
You're good, we can hear you.
Okay. This question goes to whether or not this Monte Carlo method could be used to identify changes in outcome based on whether or not the original cedar fence was employed versus a metal fence option on the perimeter of a various community versus, say, a concrete fence, a concrete Allen block fence like is those that are employed as sound barriers along South Boulder Road to Arapahoe Road along 287. We have retaining walls and then concrete Allen block fences. You can distinguish the two because the Allen block fencing is held up with these steel verticals that are generally powder coated, and it's a pretty massive fence. The question I would like to see addressed is, do any of these options result in a change in the number of structures that burned? In other words, would these probabilistic models be able to tell us whether or not investing in these more expensive fencing options would harden our community? For instance, in my subdivision, which is Coal Creek Ranch Filing 3, 139 out of 140 residential structures were lost. It didn't matter. There was no change in the outcome depending on whether you had all rock landscaping or you had an excessive amount of winter killed or brushy landscaping that you had not cleared. All of those things burned, but it didn't change the outcome for 139 out of 140 houses. So and also the lot that was open space is private land owned and managed by a Vista Medical Center. So it's not specifically included in any of this modeling. Was that due to a legal reasoning, or is it a public policy reason that you decided to exclude farmland that is not open space from this model? So I guess it's kind of two questions, but they're related. Will the model be able to tell us anything about fence options? Can it be run with various fence options, and does it have the fine grained detail to see a change of that minor magnitude? And also, what about areas that are flammable, not wildlands, not public open space, and why were they excluded from this model?
I would say I can just, one thing we do plan to do is share with our business community who often have properties that look a lot like some of our city-owned facilities, the recommendations that come from this study. So this is not something that the lessons learned can't be utilized by the private property owners as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, and on this, the scope part of the question, I'll probably pass it over to Ember, but I think that, you know, the city defined the scope of work based on public lands, and that's what we're executing on. As far as the modeling question goes, we are not doing a fine-tuned analysis, modeling analysis as a part of this project. We have a pretty quick time turnaround for this project. We're going to be racing through this assessment, doing good work, of course, but doing a fast turnaround to help get these evaluations out to the city so that they can implement them quickly and move on to identifying opportunities for pursuing grant funding if available. So on the question of, are these fences implemented in the model? I don't believe that they are. I would need to double check that, but that kind of fine level of detail will not probably show up in the state's original modeling efforts. And to do that kind of fine scale analysis, you really would need to, I guess, invest and run a separate modeling effort. And even then, I'm not sure if it would be sensitive to that response, which is kind of getting at the heart of your question.
I just want to say thank you for your efforts with this, and just, you know, it sounds like you are looking for some public input, and this was an astronomical fire that, it doesn't seem like a local fire. It seems like smaller fires, you'll have better luck with the mitigation techniques. As I lived back into Harbor Lake and specifically bought the property back to Leon World Wildlife Sanctuary. So I'm hopeful that you will take into account that I think there's some balance to be had in maintaining, what we need to maybe with lot lines on the open space, but also maintaining some of the reasons we live in Colorado, which is the wildlife, the wildlands, and that sort of thing. So, and I'm not saying that our home was significantly damaged with smoke. We're not back in, but I am still on the side of, I would like to see our wildlands maintained some. And also another point I think is important is I do have some concern if you're mowing them. It seems, at least behind our properties, that increases noxious weeds and also encourages more prairie dogs and which carry bubonic plague. And I'm not super wild about having that in my yard. So.
Thank you for that information. Do we have any online?
No online.
Yeah, I also hope that whatever you find out, you will discuss with the HOAs in the neighborhood. Ours absolutely requires wooden fencing in the back, wooden fencing on the side, and a wooden gate that leads up to and attaches to the house. Firefighters say do not have wood going up to the house because it just spreads it. We did have a neighbor who tried to put up a hurricane fence, which is metal fencing.
Small second.
very small, going from the side fence to his house, and he was told to take it out and put in wood. So this is where we are.
Yeah, appreciate that feedback. These are the kinds of comments that we're, tracking down in our forums.
Hi, thanks for all of this discussion, and residents and our experts here. I am wondering, kind of in line with Maggie, that's my neighbor, I back also to Harper Lake Open Space. And I'm wondering, if the city is taking into account, or the study will take into account, the subsequent actions. I think we're always going to be transforming our current state, and whatever mitigation activities we decide to employ, there will be subsequent needs. So, for example, we just heard reference to kind of the weed growth along some of those cut spaces. Our HOA is often employed herbicides along the fence lines between our properties and the open space. That has brought in some noxious weeds, some invasives, and cheatgrass dries really well, and I'm sure is highly flammable. Also, when the city started to employ the 10-foot buffer to the fencing, lots of folks started walking through in new ways. I've always been tipped off by an open space staff to eliminate as much walking through spaces, transfer of weeds and those types of things. So I think as we transform our landscapes and employ some of these mitigation strategies, so a year or two from now, we'll find that maybe some of those critters we don't like are going to take advantage of the lower grasslands. And I'm wondering if there's some look ahead to budgeting, signage, and those types of things for down the line.
Say yes.
I would say, just for reassurance, in our document on the proposal, one thing, especially for open space, was asking the consultants to look at each mitigation effort, but also on open space properties to look at how that balances with natural resource goals. So there will be mitigation with pros and cons, and that will go forward into the next public meeting for additional discussion. And back to your original, behind you, your neighbor, I did want to say, historically, at least in the last 15 years, I think we know about 10 wildfires that have occurred on open space. All of them were put out in less than an acre. Some of them were put out by citizens. So I think we do have a good track record also with the fire department coming and responding quickly and using the trail system to do so. So just want to add that. Thanks.
Just a question regarding, what's the definition, dumb question, but definition of a wildfire. Now, I know wildfires are out of control, but let's say it's in a forested area, maybe lightning starts a wildfire. Well, in the case of the Marshall Fire, is that we still don't know what the actual source was, but more than likely it was a man-made source of some sort. So in the definition of a wildfire is, wildfire to me means some sort of natural occurrence, but this was a combination of natural occurrence of wind. So how do you mitigate humans as the source of the fire? So if we had not had the source of humans, the fire wouldn't have occurred, even with the 100-mile-per-hour plus wind. So,
Or vice versa.
yeah. So my question is regarding: is there any concerns about how we mitigate humans creating some of these fires? We know that happens up in the Boulder area and that sort of thing, where campfires and those sorts of things occur all the time. So my question is that part of the mitigation study, is whether humans are going to be more of a source of fires than they have been in the past?
Yeah, I would say that's not a direct part of our study, but the answer is unfortunately yes, that humans are a large percentage of the cause of fires, unfortunately. And so I think that the answer to your question, though, probably gets back to some stuff that Jeff and Ember have said, which is that there's kind of a new paradigm shift that we're getting into, understanding that even though we're not in the mountains, we're in a fire, a community that is vulnerable to fire. And so as a part of that, I think probably it's a kind of a whole of many things messaging to understand that our actions need to be under the caution of what's going on in the, in our environment in that day. And so, red flag warnings, that kinds of stuff to just frame the understanding of what's happening. So I guess I would just start with that.
So I know the sheriff's office is leading a charge, working at the state level to change the red flag laws, so that they don't have as short a window to basically tell like ag users they can't burn anymore. So that's something that I'm hopeful when they give us more of a opportunity to help avoid those type of fires.
I'm gonna say, I don't want to hear this, but there's been multiple ignitions in Marshall and Excel infrastructure this year. And I'm hoping to, looking for a way to bring about a dialogue about fire hardening up there. The people in UBC have had discussions with Excel. And another thing everything that happens in Marshall affects us really, and Superior. So there's also been a discussion they've been having ongoing about getting water there to put out fires. They were not on the water main, they're all on well. And I think they've come up with a money for cisterns or something. So, so look for more, there'll be more discussion hopefully about that upwind of our community. Everything that happens there affects us. People are working on these problems, and if they're not having an open discussion, I don't know if you think about it.
We have another.
No.
We have another online question, or go ahead, and then we'll switch. Yeah.
I live in Dutch Creek area. And we had been a couple of residents. Just regularly, they're out of the storm. But you just can't, our like this, Beverly Bridge. Colorado. Never seen anything. I don't know this but I came, that's. There's a common. But I'm just hoping that maybe some times, just once a year, for some local bills, just to maintain it. Before where let's see. That's just a Christian thing. There's a big open field, which is the old place. That's a Wernberg builder, and I'm just so grateful that. Because these people's homes are right there. It seems like they did a city that's something and have open space there. And then they actually, it seems like they're really high. And then the last summer, anyway, I just appreciate the talk. And again, right.
All right, Larry.
Online.
Yeah, Larry, you want to ask your question? You'll have to unmute on your side. There you go, Larry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, in the modeling process and when you're looking at it, are you going to run scenarios on the length of the grass in the open spaces? For example, what happens if we have a 50-mile-an-hour wind with 4-foot high grass versus a 50-mile-an-hour wind with 2-foot grass versus a 50-mile-an-hour wind with a stubble field? And that would help define the width of any buffers you might want to use, and at what point the grasses are unmaintained to the point where it creates a significant risk to the community.
Yeah, that's a great question. It would definitely be an interesting modeling exercise that, we would be interested in doing, but that is outside of the scope for this project, unfortunately. It would be something where you, as you mentioned, you would have to rerun the model several times. You're basically running sensitivity analysis on the fuels itself, on the length of the grasses, to understand those mitigation benefits. So it would be an interesting exercise. But we are just using the fuels data as it exists in the model right now. So it's just that average grass length as it's in the fuels data set. In the back here.
Hi, my home was on Oak Creek Golf Course, and I was there about 17 minutes. And I was there about a month before the fire. I was out the window and the lawn was the course was the size I've ever seen in 17 years. I thought it was bad, but I didn't know about it and happen. So what I observed was that typically the sprinklers would shut off around the November timeframe, and so December was typically where it was more available for the course. So I suggest that maybe there's a way that the sprinkler is some kind of wetness be applied in off season that would help. And the other word, my home is the last home, was the last home over, and adjacent to that was open space. And the weeds were about at least 3-4 feet tall and generally not maintained. And that's very close to the old hospital. So I don't know who owns it on that, but if that could be maintained, that would help. And the other is the mowing along the fence line. Frequently, the residents have to request it. And then it will get done, but if that could be routinely maintained, that would be.
Great, thank you for that. I'm gonna pass it over to Jeff. Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. Yes, well, we definitely value the cards and the comments on that stuff.
Yeah, I just wanted to note on the golf course, one of the challenges that we've had is the water supply. That we have a municipal water supply, and so we've been trying to balance between the municipal water supply and those needs in dry years with maintain a water supply from the golf course. So we made a lot of progress in the last year. I think we're on the right track with that. So that should help with that side of things. I said that right, Jim? You had another thing that I forgot already. I was gonna say.
It was about keeping the golf course wet, off season, the open space near Vista and going around that.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So in keeping it wet, when we have the water supply, then we can do more watering throughout the year. It was definitely dry. It was super dry late last winter, early winter, all winter.
So in my time in the house, the previous years was just never an issue. It was somewhat okay, but just the December, I noticed it was exceptionally dry.
The golf course.
Yeah, the golf course was, and it was exceptionally dry. Oh, that's what I'm saying, so going forward, if there's one way to keep it that something.
Yeah, somebody in the room say climate change. In drought. And our water supply suffered. So we've been working hard on that. And then the other part was the parks and open space maintenance. Ember and her people are working on putting together improving our maintenance plans and programs so that it's not always on you have to ask kind of a basis. So I think you'll see a big difference there too.
Yes, following up with Jeff, I will say climate change. It's gonna make things worse. There was no moisture for the whole fall for the fire. We got moisture snow the day after, too late.
And
That's
that's
not-
not sense.
That's not an anomaly or in the future. We need to find ways to try and mitigate climate change. I don't know how we're gonna do that at city level, but encouraging everybody to do whatever they can to stem this problem.
Good thought. As I'm responding to some of these comments, will your work obviously respond directly, and I can imagine some of the mitigation suggestions. But will it extend to things kind of on the social science side of things, like critical points for perhaps educating or sending alerts out to residents? I'm thinking that my lawn care service sends me an alert after several weeks of different types of weather phenomena. Like now is the time to be watering your lawn in December or January, or we've noticed that we haven't had rain for 4 weeks. Can you water your trees? So triggers for me, but I'm not sure if I'm anomalous or if everyone has kind of those things on the radar screen, or if your headboard could extend into that drill.
I would say for this project, we won't be extending into that realm, unfortunately, but it's definitely a good, it's a good point. It's a good observation that those kinds of feedback would be, could be helpful in providing information basically that can be, applied by the community in response to natural environment, things happening in the natural environment.
Will you have access to insurance company models?
We will not. No. I don't know that they would provide them either. Anything else online?
Nothing on mine.
Well, thank you everyone again for attending. Thanks for taking the time to come out today and provide feedback and listen to me talk on the project and say risk too many times. So again, we're excited to be working on this project. And we, we'll be hitting the ground running. There's a lot to do in a short amount of time. So we'll be working closely with the city to get this done.
I know you just said goodbye. But I have one more question.
Sure.
So I personally am very reassured the series that the city is putting on. I think a lot of us felt for the first year where the city couldn't talk about anything. We were desperate to get some information, and this is so reassuring that the information is starting to come out. So I really appreciate the city for setting up these workshops and finally talking to us. My question is, to what degree, I mean, we all know we're all learning from what happened on that awful day. To what degree is this sparking changes in the modeling world, and is your study an anomaly, or is there like all kinds of new knowledge being applied after what happened on the 30th?
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of research going on, and Meg, you might even know better than I do, but anytime there's an event like this, absolutely, there's new lessons to be learned, new data to bring in, a new understanding of the probability of events. So wind speed, how likely are these to come in? Are we accurately portraying that in the models? There definitely is work. I know there's work in updating models for high elevation burn probabilities based on some of the fires in 2020. So there's definitely, yes, I guess to answer your question, there's active research going on all the time to improve these models and improve the way that they can simulate wildfire.
I do have another question.
Sure.
And I wish someone in the fire department could have answered it. As like it's the physical spaces around our neighborhoods, certain ways. It'd be nice to ask whether or not we can have that much on goes on. 200 yards, 300 yards, whatever it takes. They have firemen go in and race in there. And also with some water. And then it will maybe slow the speed of that fire cost because there's more people there. Superior, it was not very important. Just thinking, there's planning. Fire department. Thank God, I think I'm very well soon. You create so much of lives that they use like that. And 7 gallons.
Yeah. It still wasn't enough. That was just not enough. It was an anomaly.
But, you know, just as an example, just to have someone trained. Fire department secretary, what do we need here? By the time I next to the fire department, crew got down to Superior. So. And if they would have defensive space. And going in quickly, Nelson, like Jenny said, the Marshall. Train Road. She has that going on there, the schoolhouse home. She was able to save her husband's, they would save her by doing it. They left, they came back and understand the doubts that are still there. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. And all I can say, I think to that is that I recommend attending the home defense series. I would imagine that the fire chiefs will be somebody from the fire department.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but they're absolutely engaged in this process.
Okay, yeah.
They're in this process, they're definitely engaged.
Yeah, I guess my biggest concern is the Marshall Mesa coal seam. You know, we talk about this being an anomaly like it's never happened before. They had a fire there in 2016. They did remediation with pea gravel so that when the fire did come up through the ground, it would not catch on the brush, supposedly. There was also one probably 8 years before that. So this is a repeating thing that's happened on the coal seam. And I hope somebody's addressing that. Because if you have a coal seam and wind, we're downwind from it.
Yeah, it's upwind, and there's a phenomenon, I can't remember the actual name of the phenomena, but it's called something lift that happens upstream of Davidson Mesa, and it's a lift that comes out, from west, right? And we've been here, I don't know, 12 years or so. And I can recall hurricane force winds many times. And I was thinking part of your study may be how many occurrences of those winds have we had? And I know there's measuring equipment on the mesa, certainly in other areas. But there are things that can be studied in a model as far as the number of winds that we've had. And they certainly have had coal seam fires, or they certainly have had issues with Excel. And we've had other issues, obviously, upwind of us that could have contributed as well. So now they're talking about three possible sources of this fire, but still we don't know. But one thing I do know is that, and I come from hurricane, I've experienced 150 mile/hour winds, but there was no fire until the gas lines broke. But this had a source somewhere, and if it's one source, two source, three sources, whatever it is, those are exacerbated by these wind speeds that we see, and these are not unusual. That was unusual, but we have seen winds before in my 12 years here of 100 miles. I mean, when shingles come off roofs and that sort of stuff, we've had some high winds, and it seems to be concentrated in the Louisville and Superior area off of this lift that comes off of just upstream of us from the mesa. So I don't know if that's part of the model or not, but it seems to be, it should be.
Yeah, I mean, in general, the wind speed is definitely a part of the model. As far as, we won't be doing any updating to any of the underlying probabilities of wind speeds or data sets of wind speeds, so that the modeling framework doesn't go up to the Marshall fire event, but it does, I'm sure, include those types of wind speeds in the historical data set, because as you mentioned, they're not necessarily unique. But that combination of sustained winds, aridity, dryness in the environment, of course, as we all know, we're but to get it, so.
We have another hand raised with Larry, if you want to, since we're still doing questions. Go ahead, Larry.
I would just like to say, I've lived in Colorado all my life. I'm in my 70s. High winds are common on the Front Range from Fort Collins to Pueblo. Periodic droughts are common in Colorado. They have been my whole life. They'll continue to be there. So I think while this fire was an anomaly, it's generally because the thing that has changed in the environment here is we've taken agricultural lands out of production, we've put houses in, and we've taken lands adjacent those houses and confused poor maintenance with natural. So I would just like to emphasize again, we need to maintain our open spaces if we're going to live adjacent to them. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's no better closer than that.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you all again for coming today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, appreciate it.